The city never sleeps. But it's not the noise that should keep you awake. It's what hides inside it. Every street has a story. Every hallway remembers something. And some places were never meant to be found. This is NullxSector, where the ordinary fractures and something else leaks through. The 417. I have been watching this city for a long time. Longer than you might be comfortable knowing about. Long enough to remember when the tunnels were new and the concrete still held the warmth of the hands that poured it. Long enough to have noticed certain patterns, certain repetitions. The city breathes on a schedule most people never bother to learn, and that is fine. That is probably for the best. But Mara Osei learned it. That was her mistake, and I say that with something close to admiration. Because most people walk through a city and see only the surface of it. The storefronts, the faces, the light changing on the glass of buildings. They see what the city wants them to see, and they go home and they sleep, and they do not wonder what the city does with all that dark when they close their eyes. Mara wondered. She had been wondering for 3 years, and when you wonder long enough, the city starts to wonder back. That is where this story begins. Fulton Street Station sits at the bottom of Broadway in Lower Manhattan, where the A, the C, and the E lines converge in a tangle of concrete and iron that smells like mineral water and old electricity. During the day, it is ordinary in the particular way that New York subway stations are ordinary. Loud and layered and moving all the time. People flowing through it like blood through a valve, never stopping, never looking, always going somewhere that feels more important than here. The tiles on the platform walls are a cream color that has not been cream for a very long time. The columns that hold up the ceiling are thick and old, and sweating slightly with the moisture that has been seeping through the rock above them since before most of the people using the station were born. It is the kind of place that accumulates history the way a coat accumulates smell. You cannot scrub it out. It is in the material. At 4 in the morning, it is a different thing entirely. At 4 in the morning, Fulton Street belongs to a smaller city that runs inside the regular one. The overnight crew, the shift workers, the people who made choices, or who had choices made for them, that put them underground while everyone else is horizontal and dreaming. A homeless man on a bench near the south end, wrapped in a sleeping bag someone donated and then forgot about. A nurse in blue scrubs eating from a paper bag and watching something on her phone, the screen light making her face pale and hollow in a way that she does not know and would not appreciate. The cleaner at the far end of the platform, moving their mop in slow arcs, headphones in, somewhere else entirely. There is a specific quality of light in a subway station at 4 in the morning that I find difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. The fluorescents are the same fluorescents. The tile is the same tile. The advertisements in their scratched plastic frames are the same advertisements they were at noon, but something in the equation has changed. The human traffic that usually absorbs and softens the geometry of the place is gone, and what is left is just the station itself, staring back at you with its old pale face. The angles of it become more apparent. The depth of the tunnel mouths at either end of the platform becomes a thing you are aware of in your body, not just your eyes. The city above you, all of its noise and weight and indifferent forward motion, is still there, and yet it feels very far away. As if you have stepped into a different layer of things. As if the station exists at a slight remove from the world that uses it. Mara Osei had stood on that platform at 4 in the morning more times than she could accurately count. She was 38 years old and had worked for the MTA as a transit safety officer for 11 years. Before that, she had studied urban infrastructure at City College on a partial scholarship and had written her thesis on the relationship between subway expansion and neighborhood mortality in New York between 1960 and 1990. She was not a credulous person. She was not the kind of person who imagined things or inflated a coincidence into a conspiracy. She was the kind of person who carried a clipboard and wrote things down with a specific pen she kept in the left chest pocket of her uniform jacket, and who had once filed a 14-page internal report about a ventilation irregularity in the passageway connecting the L to the AC because the irregularity bothered her, and she needed to understand it. The report had not won her any particular affection from her supervisors. She had filed it anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. She had grown up in Crown Heights with her sister Edwoa and their mother, a woman who worked double shifts at a hospital in Flatbush for the first 15 years of Mara's life, and who had given both her daughters the particular gift of stubbornness by example. Mara was the older one by 4 years, and had spent most of her childhood feeling responsible for Edwoa in a way that Edwoa found both touching and mildly suffocating. Edwoa had been the one who talked more, laughed louder, filled rooms with a presence that Mara expressed differently, which was to say precisely, and with great attention to detail. They had both ended up working for the city, which their mother considered proof that the city had done right by them, and which Mara considered simply a function of the fact that they had both grown up inside it and understood it the way you understand a place that shaped you, from the inside out. She had been logging the 417 for 3 weeks when the face she recognized stepped off the train. I want to tell you about that moment carefully because it matters, because the way that moment landed on Mara is the whole story, really. The train had been appearing for at least 3 weeks that she knew of, and from the logs she had been quietly pulling from records that were not strictly available to her level of clearance, it had been appearing for considerably longer than that. The precise details of its appearance were consistent. The wind on the platform came first, always at 4:16 and 51 seconds. Then the amber light in the tunnel, not the white headlight of a standard A train, not the yellow of the older rolling stock. Amber, dim and warm and wrong in a way that made the back of Mara's neck respond before her brain had processed what she was seeing. Then the train itself, arriving with almost no sound. That was the detail that had first stopped her cold, 3 weeks earlier, on a Thursday morning when she had been doing a routine inspection of the platform's emergency communication equipment. She had heard, or rather felt, the air pressure shift that preceded a train's arrival, and she had looked up expecting the rumble and the screech and the industrial presence of 60 tons of steel moving through a tube. And instead there was just the train, present, as if it had always been there and she had only just noticed it. 8 cars, older than the current fleet. The car numbers belonged to a series that had been retired in 2007. The windows were fogged from inside with a warmth that meant bodies. She could see shapes, passengers or things shaped like passengers, standing and sitting in the amber interior light, all facing forward, all in the particular stillness of people mid-commute who have long since stopped noticing where they are. The doors opened. 9 seconds. She had not counted the first time. She had stood frozen in the particular paralysis of a person whose rationality is working very hard and losing ground fast. But she remembered it afterward as approximately 9 seconds, and every subsequent night she had timed it exactly, and it was always 9 seconds. The doors opened for 9 seconds, and then they closed, and the train pulled away back into the tunnel it had come from, which was a tunnel that had been sealed since 2009 after a partial structural collapse. 3 weeks of this before she saw the face. On the night that changed everything, Mara arrived at 23 minutes past 4 in the morning and took her position at the far south end of the platform near the utility door that led to the sealed tunnel access. She had her clipboard. She had her stopwatch. She had begun to think of herself, with a dark humor she did not share with anyone, as a naturalist observing an animal that did not know it was being watched. The wind came at 4:16 and 51 seconds. The amber light appeared in the tunnel mouth. The train arrived. The doors opened, and Mara clicked her stopwatch, and she looked into the car directly in front of her, and at the far end of it, holding a center pole with one hand the way you do when you have ridden this line so many times that you no longer think about holding on, was her sister Edwoa. I need you to understand something about what it means to recognize a person you love who should not be there. It is not like seeing a stranger who resembles someone you know. That produces a small, pleasant jolt, a half-second of confusion, a correction. What Mara experienced looking into that car was the opposite of confusion. It was absolute recognition landing in a body that had not prepared for it. The particular way Edwoa held her shoulders, the slight forward tilt she had always had when standing, as if perpetually leaning toward whatever was coming next. The hair. The jawline that was a narrower version of Mara's own. Edwoa Ose had died on March 3, 2009, in a partial tunnel collapse at the south end of Fulton Street Station. Except that she had not died, officially. Officially, the MTA had recorded her as having evacuated through an alternate exit during the incident and subsequently resigned from her position as a junior structural inspector. There was a resignation letter on file that Mara had obtained through 6 months of Freedom of Information requests and 2 threatened lawsuits. The letter was 4 sentences long and read like something written by a person who had never met Edwoa, because Edwoa had been constitutionally incapable of writing 4 sentences when 40 would serve the purpose. There was no alternate exit. Mara knew this because she had spent the better part of 2 years mapping every access point in that section of tunnel using records that predated the 2009 collapse, and the only exits were the platform at Fulton Street and a maintenance hatch 1,012 feet into the tunnel that had been sealed by the collapse itself. If Edwoa had walked out of that tunnel, she had walked out through the platform, in front of multiple transit workers, in the middle of a declared emergency, and not one of them had logged her as present. So Mara had come to the one conclusion that the evidence supported. She had not told anyone this conclusion because she was not stupid. She had instead begun showing up at Fulton Street at 4 in the morning with a clipboard and a stopwatch. And now her sister was on a train in a sealed tunnel, and Edwoa had turned her head, and their eyes had met, and Edwoa had looked at her with an expression that Mara would spend the next 24 hours trying to accurately name, and could only come up with this. The expression of a person who has been waiting for something they knew was coming, and is not sure whether they are relieved or terrified that it finally arrived. The doors closed at 9 seconds exactly. The train pulled away into the dark. Mara wrote in her log, "Female, known," and then she sat down on the platform floor, which she had never done before in 11 years of working underground, and she stayed there for a long time while the city above her started its day without knowing anything was wrong. She found Del Miro in the break room at 6:15 that morning, which was the only time you could reliably find him sitting still. He was 63 years old and had inspected this line since 1991, and he had the particular quality of a person who has seen enough that almost nothing surprises him anymore, which Mara had always taken to mean he was unflappable, but which she was beginning to understand might mean something else entirely. She sat down across from him and she told him what she had been seeing, not the part about Edwoa, just the train. He listened to her without changing his expression. He finished his coffee. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small spiral notebook that was so old the cover had gone soft, and he placed it on the table between them. She opened it to the first page and found a date from 1994. He had been logging the same thing for 30 years. The notations were brief: time of appearance, duration of door opening, estimated passenger count, always noted with a question mark because he had clearly never been certain whether to call them passengers. He had his own shorthand for the color of the interior light, a small drawing of a sun with the word wrong written next to it, which made something tighten in Mara's chest because she had used almost the same language in her own head. He told her about the man in the 1970s transit uniform he had seen step off the train in 2003. How he had watched this person walk the length of the platform with the unhurried gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going, and then simply not be there anymore, not disappear in any dramatic sense, just, at a certain point, no longer present in the space he had occupied. He told her the tunnel had been sealed in 2009, not because of the collapse exactly, but because of what they found after the collapse. The structural report listed the cause as equipment failure. He had been on site during the assessment, and he knew the engineers who wrote that report, and he also knew that 2 of them had taken early retirement within a year of filing it, which he did not think was a coincidence. He told her that 3 workers had entered the collapsed section for the assessment and 2 had come out. He had known the 3rd one, not well, just as a face and a name on the roster. Junior Inspector, relatively new. He said her first name and then stopped and looked at Mara and said, "You already knew that?" Mara said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he thought the tunnel had not so much trapped her as taken her somewhere, or rather somewhen, and he knew how that sounded, and he had spent 15 years deciding he did not care how it sounded. Then he said, "Do not get on the train." Not as a question, not as a suggestion. He said it the way you say something when you have thought about it for a very long time and have arrived at a certainty that sits in your bones rather than your mind. Mara said she understood. She took his notebook home with her own, and she spent the afternoon cross-referencing the dates and building a timeline on her kitchen table. And the timeline did what timelines do when you finally have enough data points, which is it started to show you the shape of the thing underneath the thing. The shape was this. The collapse had happened at 4:17 in the morning on March 3, 2009. The partial collapse of 140 feet of tunnel wall, caused, officially, by a failure in the lateral support system during an emergency inspection. 3 workers present. 2 had been closer to the platform end of the tunnel and had run toward the light when they heard the first crack. 1 had been deep enough in that running toward the light was not an option. The time was not a coincidence. She had known that since she started seeing the train, but now she understood it in a different way. The train did not happen at 4:17 because 4:17 was a special time in some abstract or mystical sense. 4:17 was when the collapse happened, and the collapse had created a loop, and the loop ran every morning because that is what loops do. They do not know how to stop. They were not built with a stopping mechanism because they were not built at all. They simply began, and continuing was the only thing they knew. Every person on that train had been there at 4:17 on March 3, 2009. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the man in the 1970s uniform that Del Miro had seen step off in 2003, and she rearranged the math in her head. If the loop was drawing from 4:17 across time, not just from a single date, then the train was full of people from every 4:17 this tunnel had ever known. Decades of them. The line had been running since 1932. 77 years of 4:17s before Idwoa had walked into that tunnel with her clipboard and her flashlight, and her habit of leaning forward toward whatever was coming. She had sat with that for a while. Then she found the file she had been building on section 4.17 of the City Infrastructure Containment Protocol. She had stumbled across the reference 8 months earlier while researching an unrelated zoning dispute and had initially assumed it was a code for something mundane. Contamination protocol, maybe, or a maintenance classification. But the language in the section was not the language of contamination or maintenance. It was careful language. Legal language calibrated to describe something real while sounding like it was describing something administrative. The kind of language that takes years to develop. The kind that gets refined across multiple administrations by people whose job is specifically to make sure that what is being said cannot be clearly understood by anyone who has not already been told what it means. Locations exhibiting persistent temporal recursion or spatial overlay inconsistent with standard urban infrastructure behavior. That was what it said. There were 14 such locations currently logged in the city. Fulton Street was number 1 on the list. It had been number 1 since 1974, which meant the city had known about this for 35 years before the collapse that took Idwoa, and they had kept the line running, and they had kept the station open, and they had built their filing code and their protocol and their careful language, and they had continued. The trains ran, the schedules published. The commuters came and went, and never knew that in a room somewhere, in a filing system that had its own section numbering, someone had given a name to the thing that waited every morning in the sealed tunnel. The city had a form for this. There were names attached to the protocol, administrators going back 4 decades, and Mara had begun pulling on those threads as well. And what she found was that the people who held that file tended to retire early or transfer laterally to positions that had nothing to do with infrastructure. One had died in 2004 of a heart attack at age 49. One had left the city government entirely and moved to a town in Vermont with no subway system for 100 miles in any direction. The current administrator, the person whose name appeared on the most recent revision of the protocol's language, was a woman named Geraldine Park, who had an office in the Department of City Planning, and who had, in a brief phone interview that Mara had conducted under the pretense of a zoning inquiry 6 weeks ago, gone very quiet when Mara had asked, casually and without announcement, whether she was familiar with the Fulton Street site. She had said, "I am going to need you to not call this number again." And then she had hung up, which was not the response of a person who did not know what Mara was talking about. That was the part that sat heaviest in Mara's chest. Not the loop, not the train, not her sister's face in amber light. The knowledge that somewhere in a municipal building in Lower Manhattan, a file existed with Fulton Street's name on it, and in that file was a description of exactly what was happening at 4:17 every morning, and the people who maintained that file had decided that operations would continue as normal. She wondered how long you had to work for a city before you could make that decision with a steady hand. On the second night, she arrived at 4:09, same as always, and she stood at the platform's south end, and she stood closer to the edge than she had before. She had spent the day doing something she did not fully acknowledge she was doing. She had eaten a meal slowly, tasting it. She had called her mother, which she did not do often enough and knew it, and had talked for 40 minutes about ordinary things, the kind of conversation that felt like touching something solid just to confirm it was still there. She had sat on her fire escape for an hour in the cold and looked at the city and tried to see it as a stranger would, from outside, without the weight of everything she knew about it pressing down on her chest. She had not packed a bag. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had not packed a bag. The wind came at 4:16 and 51 seconds, right on schedule. The amber light bled out of the tunnel mouth and washed over the rails and the track bed, and the dirty platform edge in a color that had no business being that warm this far underground. The train arrived with its particular absence of sound, and the doors opened, and the 9 seconds began, and Mara walked to the threshold. Not onto the train. She was precise about this afterward in her log. She did not step onto the train. She stood at the threshold, 1 foot still on the platform, and she looked into the car. And she saw them clearly for the first time. 25 passengers in that car alone, dressed in clothes from different decades with a specificity that felt less like costume and more like record. A woman in a belted coat from the early 80s with a folded newspaper tucked under her arm. 2 teenage boys in 90s streetwear, one of them with headphones around his neck attached to a CD player. A man who wore a transit worker's uniform with a patch from a union chapter that had merged and changed its name in 1988. They were all in the particular stillness of people in transit who have long since run out of things to think about and have settled into the animal rhythm of the moving car. None of them looked at her, except Adwoa at the far end of the car, holding her pole, looking straight down the length of the space between them with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for this specific moment and wanted to make sure she did not waste it. Adwoa shook her head. Not frantically, not with urgency or pleading. She shook her head the way she had always communicated the most important things, which was slowly and without drama, and in a way that left you in absolutely no doubt about what she meant. No. Mara stood at the threshold and felt the floor of the car under the front of her foot, and it was warm and solid and real, and she could feel the ambient temperature of the car on her face, warmer than the platform, the warmth of bodies that had been enclosed for a long time. And she thought about what Del Miro had said, which was, the train did not trap her. The train took her somewhere. She thought about what it meant that somewhere was inside a loop. She thought about the third transit worker whose file said resigned. She thought about what you become if you board a train that runs the same 9 seconds of the same morning forever. 2 seconds of silence then. Complete silence, the kind that does not occur naturally this far underground in a living city. No fluorescent hum, no distant rumble of the working lines. No ventilation, no rats, no drip of water from the ceiling seams. Just the amber light in her sister's face and the warm, solid floor under the front of her foot. Mara stepped back onto the platform. The doors closed at 9 seconds exactly. The train pulled away into the sealed tunnel, and the sound came back, and the fluorescence came back, and the city came back. And Mara stood on the platform with her clipboard against her chest and watched the amber light shrink to a point and disappear. She wrote in her log for a long time that morning. Here is what I want you to understand about Mara Osai, because I think it is the most important thing. She was not done. Stepping back from the train was not surrender, and it was not acceptance. It was information gathering. She had stood at the threshold because she needed to know what the threshold felt like. And now she knew, and the knowing was a data point. And data points were what you used to understand a system. And once you understood a system, you could work out how to reach inside it. Adwoa had said no. Adwoa had said no from the inside of a loop that ran on the worst moment of her life for approximately 16 years before Mara had found it. And Adwoa was a person who had always known more than she said, who had always carried information carefully, who had always protected Mara from things she thought Mara was not ready for, and who had been, on that point, wrong with a consistency that drove Mara quietly insane throughout their whole shared life. So the no was real, and the no was also something to be understood, not simply accepted. The city had a file on this. The city had 14 locations and a containment protocol and a code number that had been assigned in 1974, which meant somewhere in the municipal infrastructure of New York there were people, or there had been people, whose job was to know what Mara knew. And people who had jobs left records, even when they did not mean to, and records were something that Mara had 11 years of experience extracting from institutions that did not want to give them up. She was going to find out what was on the other side of Adwoa's no. Not recklessly, not with sentiment, with a clipboard and a pen and the particular methodical stubbornness of a woman who had written a 14-page report about a ventilation irregularity because it bothered her, and she could not leave things that bothered her alone. She had been doing this job for 11 years. She knew this system, or she had thought she did, and now she knew it was larger and stranger than she had understood, and that knowledge did not frighten her in the way that people who have never looked directly at a hard thing imagine that looking at it must feel. It focused her. It gave her the clean, sharp feeling of a problem that had finally shown her its actual shape. Dawn was coming. She could feel it the way you can sometimes feel weather before it arrives, a change in the quality of the air, the light above the grate at the top of the station stairs shifting from black to the specific dark blue that precedes everything else. Mara sat on the platform bench, not the one the overnight sleepers used, and opened Del Miro's notebook and her own notebook side by side, and she began to build something. I have told you this story as accurately as I know how. I want to be honest with you about what I mean when I say I know. I have been in this city longer than the city itself, in the sense that I was here before anyone thought to call it anything, when it was just an island and a river, and the space below ground that nobody had yet decided to cut open and fill with iron. I have watched it become what it is. I have watched it develop its habits and its systems and its filing codes and its particular way of accommodating the things it cannot explain by explaining them as other things. Section 4.17 is not the only place in this city where the surface and what lies beneath the surface have found each other. It is the oldest, and it is the one that has been waiting the longest, and it is the one where a woman named Mara Osai is sitting on a platform bench right now, as you hear this, building a structure from evidence and intending to use it. I do not know what she will find in the files that Section 4.17 points toward. I know what I have seen, which is that the city has been containing and logging and carefully not explaining things like this for longer than most of its current administrators have been alive. And I know that the people who wrote those files did so because they had encountered what cannot be explained and needed it to fit in a drawer somewhere, and that the filing is not the same as understanding. Mara is going to try to understand. I will be here when she does. I find, in watching her, something I recognize from my long familiarity with the people who have moved through this city and made it what it is. The ones who lasted. The ones who looked at the city's hard and hidden face and did not look away. They share a quality I do not have a clean word for. It is not courage exactly, because courage implies fear overcome, and Mara is not overcoming fear. She is simply in the presence of a very large question and is constitutionally unable to leave it unanswered. It is something older than courage. It is the thing that built the tunnels in the first place. The willingness to go into the dark and see what is down there, not because you know it will be safe, but because not knowing is worse. The city keeps its secrets in the dark. Mara Osai is going down to get them. And I will be watching as I have always watched, from the place just behind the surface of things where something like me waits and wonders what the people in the light will do next. The 417 arrives every morning at Fulton Street Station. You can be there at 4:09 if you want to see it. Stand at the south end of the platform, wait for the wind. But I would strongly suggest you do not stand too close to the edge. And if the doors open and something inside looks at you the way Edwoa looked at Mara, with that slow, certain recognition, with that single careful shake of the head, listen to it. Not every door that opens is an invitation. Some of them are warnings, and the city has been running out of time to deliver them. Some stories end. Others stay with you. If you've made it this far, you're already part of the sector. New reports surface every week, and the city always has more to show you. So subscribe, stay aware, and whatever you do, don't ignore what feels off, because the next story might be yours.